Hello, welcome to Heavenward Ministries. In this video, we'll be talking about Psalm 4. We read, Answer me when I call to you, O my righteous God. Give me relief from my distress. Be merciful to me and hear my prayer. How long, O men, will you turn my glory into shame? How long will you love delusions and seek false gods? Know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord will hear when I call to him. In your anger do not sin. When you are on your beds, search your hearts and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and trust in the Lord. Many are asking, who can show us any good? Let the light of your face shine upon us, O Lord. You have filled my heart with greater joy than when their grain and new wine abound. I will lie down and sleep in peace. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. So, let's look at the context of Psalm 4. According to the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges, Psalm 3 and Psalm 4 are closely connected and should be studied together. We'll just be looking at Psalm 4 in this video. Psalm 3 is a morning hymn after a night spent safely in the midst of danger. Psalm 4 an evening hymn when the danger, though less imminent, has not passed away. In Psalm 3, the author is attacked by enemies, not apparently foreigners, whose project is profane and unprincipled. His cause is pronounced desperate, but with unshaken faith, he appeals to the experience of past deliverances, and with absolute confidence casts himself upon Jehovah for protection and deliverance. Psalm 4 was written somewhat later when David had time to reflect on the true character of the rebellion, perhaps at Mahanaim, which was his headquarters for some time. So some days at least have elapsed since Psalm 3. The immediate personal peril is past. Reflection has deepened David's consciousness of his own integrity and his sense of the rebel's guilt. The psalm breathes a spirit of righteous indignation, which rises completely above mere personal vindictiveness. Psalm 4 can be separated into 4 sections. In the first section of Psalm 4, verses 1 and 2, we find an appeal to God and a remonstrance, or that is a rebuke or a protest against the rebels. Second section of Psalm 4, the true character of the rebellion is exposed in verses 3 and 4. In the third section, verses 5 and 6, the better way is indicated. And in the fourth section of Psalm 4, verses 7 and 8, we find the supreme joy of perfect trust. Let's go right to verse 1. Answer me when I call to you, O my righteous God. The Kyle and Delitzsch Old Testament commentary interprets these words this way. Quote, Yahweh is the possessor of righteousness, the author of righteousness, and the vindicator of misjudged and persecuted righteousness. This God of righteousness David believingly calls his God, for the righteousness David possesses, he possesses in him, and the righteousness David looks for, he looks for in him. Continue reading in Psalm 4. Give me relief from my distress. Be merciful to me and hear my prayer. It's worthwhile for these verses to look at other translations. We find in the New King James Version, we read the translation, You have relieved me in my distress. In the King James Bible Version, Thou hast enlarged me when I was in distress. So give me relief from my distress. Charles Ellicott explains this is better worded, quote, In my straitness thou hast made room for me, or in my straitness thou who hast made room for me. This is a thought very common in the Psalter, and apparently was a favorite phrase of David's, occurring in Psalm 18, verse 19, and in other psalms attributed to him. The Kyle and Delitzsch Old Testament commentary explains, quote, that this prayer is not in vain. David's previous experience assures him, quote, Thou hast made a breadth of space for me when I was in a strait. He bases his prayer on 2 things, on his fellowship with God, the righteous God, and on his justifying grace, God's justifying grace, which David has already experienced. He has been many times in a strait already, and God has made a broad place for him. Moving on in Psalm 4 to verse 2. How long, O men, will you turn my glory into shame? How long will you love delusions and seek false gods? The Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges explains, quote, the rebellion is a vain thing, destined to end in failure, like the threatened uprising of the nations. We are referred to Psalm 2 verse 1. It is a lie, for it is based on the false principle of vain ambition, setting itself up against the divinely appointed king. There is no need to inquire whether David's personal honor or his royal dignity is meant. Both are included, or both were defamed and insulted, but it was an aggravation of the rebels' offense that the king had a special glory as the representative of Jehovah. David contrasts the rebels with God, the defender of his cause. Moving forward in Psalm 4, verse 3, know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord will hear when I call to him. So, know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The godly, according to the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges, godly means the covenant relationship is more prominent in the word godly than a moral excellence, though that is presupposed. Know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself, has set apart or has distinguished. The verb combines the idea of marvelous dealing with that of choice and separation. Charles Ellicott explains, quote, besides David's innate greatness, David has a grandeur and dignity derived from his deep sense of the covenant between God and his anointed, and his own imperfect but sincere endeavor to act worthily the part of God's vice-regent on earth. His selection by Jehovah is an unanswerable reply to his calumniators and the surest proof of his own uprightness. Continuing along in Psalm 4, we read, verse 4, in your anger do not sin. When you are on your beds, search your hearts and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and trust in the Lord. Writes John Calvin, this is an exercise which is opposed to their indulgence of their unruly passions. According to the Kyle and Dellett's Old Testament commentary, David is saying, in other words, come to your right mind by self-examination. Cease your tumult. This is a warning coming with the semblance of a command by reason of the consciousness of innocence on David's part. The rebels are to repent and cleave to Yahweh instead of allowing themselves to be carried away by arrogance and discontent. They are to renounce the self-trust which blinds them in their opposition to the king. In other words, according to the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges, David is saying, let wholesome fear deter you from persisting in this course of action, which is nothing less than sinful. John Calvin explains, quote, the sum, in other words, therefore is, quote, you boast of having God on your side because you have free access to his altar to offer your sacrifices there with great pomp, and because I am banished from the Holy Land and not suffered to come to the temple, you think that I am not an object of the divine care. But you must worship God in a far different manner, if you would expect any good at his hand. For your unclean sacrifices, with which you pollute his altar, so far from rendering him favorable to you, will do nothing else but provoke his wrath. Let us learn from this passage that in contending with the corrupters of true religion, who may have the name of God continually in their mouth, and vaunt themselves on account of their observance of his outward worship, we may safely rebuke their boasting, because they do not offer the right sacrifices. But at the same time we must beware lest a vain pretense of godliness foster in us a perverse and ill-founded confidence in place of true hope. John Calvin explains the context and circumstances of these verses here this way, quote, meanwhile the Ark of the Covenant was in the hands of his enemies, David's enemies. They kept possession of the temple, and they were the first in offering sacrifices. They therefore vaunted themselves against David with the same boldness and presumption with which we know hypocrites to have always been puffed up. Nor is it to be doubted, but they proudly abused the name of God as if they only had been his true worshippers. But as Jeremiah 7 verse 4 rebukes the ungodly because of the false confidence which they placed in the temple of the Lord, so David also denies that God is pacified by mere outward ceremonies, since he requires pure sacrifices. John Calvin continues, quote, "He teaches us that men, instead of wickedly pouring forth their anger against their neighbors, have rather just cause to be angry with themselves, in order that, by this means, they may abstain from sin. And therefore he commands them rather to fret inwardly, and be angry with themselves, and then to be angry not so much at the persons as at the vices of others." Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges explains these words this way. In other words, let them approach him in a right spirit, and instead of impatiently trying to remedy evils by revolution, they should rely entirely upon God's guidance. So, moving forward in Psalm 4, verse 6, many are asking, who can show us any good? Let the light of your face shine upon us, O Lord. You have filled my heart with greater joy than when their grain and new wine abound. John Calvin interprets these verses this way, quote, "I do not quarrel with the interpretation which supposes that David is here complaining of his own followers, who, finding their strength insufficient for bearing the hardships which befell them, and exhausted by weariness and grief, indulged in complaints, and anxiously desired repose. But I am rather inclined to extend the words farther, and to view them as meaning that David, contented with the favor of God alone, protests that he disregards and sets no value on objects which others ardently desire," writes John Calvin. As for verse 6, many are asking, who can show us any good? It's worthwhile to look at other translations. The New International Version translates this verse as, Many, Lord, are asking, who will bring us prosperity? And the New American Bible translation reads, many say, may we see better times. David, therefore, intimates in the first place that all those are fools who, wishing to enjoy prosperity, do not begin with seeking the favor of God, for by neglecting to do this, they are carried about by the various opinions which are abroad. In the second place, he rebukes another vice, namely, that of gross and earthly men in giving themselves wholly to the ease and comforts of the flesh, and in settling down in, or contenting themselves with, the enjoyment of these alone, without thinking of anything higher. Whence also it comes to pass, that as long as they are supplied with other things according to their desire, they are altogether indifferent about God, just as if they had no need of him. David, on the contrary, testifies that although he may be destitute of all other good things, the fatherly love of God is sufficient to compensate for the loss of them all. This, therefore, is the purport of the whole. Quote, the greater number of men greedily seek after present pleasures and advantages, but I maintain that perfect felicity is only to be found in the favor of God. The psalm is that David had more satisfaction in seeing the reconciled countenance of God beaming upon him than if he had possessed garners full of corn and cellars full of wine. And the final verse of Psalm 4, I will lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. John Calvin writes, quote, let us therefore learn from his example to yield this honor to God, to believe that although there may appear no help for us from men, yet under his hand, God's hand alone, we are kept in peace and safety, as if we were surrounded by a great host. This concludes this video. Peace be with you.